There's an island in the middle of the Bay of Bengal where the modern world has almost no place. No airports, no hotels, no roads, no tourists, and no welcome for outsiders. From the air, North Sentinel Island looks almost like paradise. A thick blanket of green forest, white beaches stretching along the coastline, and endless blue water surrounding it in every direction. But beyond those beautiful shores lies one of the most isolated societies on Earth. The people who live there have resisted contact with the outside world for generations, and today, almost nobody is allowed to approach their island. Not because there is a military base guarding it, not because the island is radioactive, and not because there is some lost civilization hiding beneath the trees. The reason is far more complicated. For the people of North Sentinel, contact with the outside world could be deadly, and for outsiders who attempt to enter their territory, the consequences can be deadly too. So how did this tiny island become one of the most inaccessible places on Earth? Who are the people who live there? Why have they rejected the modern world? And perhaps most importantly, why has the rest of the world agreed to leave them alone? To understand the answer, we have to travel back through centuries of history, to a time when the island was already home to a people who had developed almost completely beyond the reach of modern civilization. This is the story of North Sentinel Island, a place where the world's oldest instinct, survival, may be the very reason its people remain hidden from us. For thousands of years, North Sentinel Island existed far beyond the attention of the modern world. While kingdoms rose and disappeared across Asia, while ships crossed the Indian Ocean, and while empires expanded across the region, the people of this small island continued living according to a world of their own. They hunted, they fished, they gathered food from the forest, and they built their lives around the resources of the island and the surrounding sea. No written history tells us exactly how long they have lived there. And that is one of the first great mysteries of North Sentinel, because the Sentinelese left behind no books, no monuments, no written records explaining where they came from. Most of what the outside world knows has been learned from brief encounters, observations from a distance, archaeological evidence, and accounts recorded by people who approached the island over the centuries. But there is something important to understand. The Sentinelese are not simply a people who were lost from civilization. They are an indigenous society that developed its own way of life, and for reasons we can only partly understand, maintained an extraordinary degree of independence from the outside world. Their isolation was also shaped by geography. North Sentinel is surrounded by ocean. There are no neighboring cities, no bridges, no natural highways connecting it to the mainland. For much of human history, reaching the island required crossing open water, and for an isolated community, that ocean became more than a physical barrier. It became a shield, a boundary between their world and ours. But eventually that boundary was crossed. Ships began appearing on the horizon. Strangers began approaching the beaches, and the outside world slowly discovered that there was a community living on the island. What happened next would shape the story of North Sentinel forever, because the first encounters between the islanders and outsiders were not simply meetings between strangers. They were encounters between two completely different worlds, with almost nothing in common and almost no way to understand each other. And as the age of exploration expanded across the Indian Ocean, North Sentinel could no longer remain completely hidden. The island had been isolated for centuries, but the outside world was getting closer, and soon, someone would come ashore. And someone did come ashore. But the first encounters with North Sentinel would reveal just how dangerous contact could become. In the 19th century, ships traveling through the waters around the Andaman Islands were beginning to bring the outside world closer to the island. Then, in 1867, something unexpected happened. A merchant vessel called the Nineveh was wrecked on a reef near North Sentinel. More than 100 passengers and crew members were suddenly stranded on the shore. For days, they waited for rescue, but they were not alone. The people of the island were watching. According to later accounts, the stranded survivors saw armed islanders approaching the beach. The situation became tense. The survivors tried to defend themselves with whatever they had, and eventually a rescue vessel arrived and took them away. For the Sentinelese, however, the encounter was only the beginning. The outside world had discovered their island, and the islanders had discovered something equally important. Strangers could arrive from the sea. They could appear without warning, and they could come carrying unfamiliar objects, unfamiliar weapons, and unfamiliar intentions. Then, more than a decade later, another encounter would become even more disturbing. In the late 19th century, British colonial authorities began taking a much greater interest in the peoples of the Andaman Islands. Among those officials was Maurice Vidal Portman. He was determined to make contact with the Sentinelese. But what happened when his expedition reached the island would leave a dark mark on the history of North Sentinel. Portman and his party landed on the island and began following trails through the forest. They found abandoned settlements. They found signs that people had been living there. But the islanders themselves had disappeared into the forest. Then the expedition encountered something unexpected, an elderly couple and 4 children. Instead of leaving them alone, the expedition took them from the island and transported them to Port Blair. The adults soon became seriously ill, and both died. The children also became sick. Eventually, they were returned to North Sentinel with gifts, but no one could know what diseases they might have carried back with them. It was a tragic example of a danger that would become central to the entire history of isolated peoples. Contact did not have to begin with violence to become deadly. Sometimes, all it took was a breath, a cough, a virus, a disease that one population had learned to survive, but another had never encountered. And there was another lesson hidden inside that tragedy. The Sentinelese had not asked to be discovered. They had not invited the outside world onto their beaches, and yet outsiders had entered their territory, taken people from their homes, and brought them into a world they had never known. For the people on that island, the memory of such encounters could only have been frightening. And as the decades passed, the outside world would continue to approach, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with scientific ambition, sometimes with gifts, and sometimes with far more dangerous intentions. But the Sentinelese had begun sending a message that would become clearer with every encounter: stay away. And as the 20th century approached, the question was no longer whether the outside world knew about North Sentinel. it did. The question was, what would happen when the outside world refused to stay away? But the story of North Sentinel did not end with the 1991 encounter. In fact, the decades that followed would make the island even more famous. After years of failed and sometimes dangerous contact attempts, India gradually abandoned its efforts to establish regular contact with the Sentinelese. By the mid-1990s, the gift-dropping missions had stopped. The principle was simple. If the Sentinelese wanted to remain alone, the outside world should respect that decision. Then came December 2004. A massive earthquake beneath the Indian Ocean triggered one of the deadliest tsunamis in modern history. The Andaman Islands were struck with enormous force. North Sentinel was hit, too. For a short time, nobody knew whether the islanders had survived. Then an Indian Coast Guard helicopter flew over the island. A Sentinelese man appeared on the beach. He raised a bow toward the helicopter. The message was unmistakable. They were alive, and they wanted to be left alone. But the danger did not disappear. In 2006, 2 Indian fishermen illegally entered the protected waters around North Sentinel. Their boat drifted toward the island. They never returned. The incident reinforced the government's position that the island was not a place for outsiders to visit. Then came the most internationally publicized attempt to enter North Sentinel. In November 2018, an American missionary named John Allen Chau secretly traveled to the region. He wanted to make contact with the Sentinelese. Despite warnings and legal restrictions, he paid local fishermen to take him toward the island. He attempted to approach the shore several times. The Sentinelese resisted his attempts. On his final attempt, he was killed. The incident shocked the world, but it also reignited an important question. Was the Sentinelese response simply hostility, or were they protecting themselves from a world that had repeatedly brought danger to their shores? The answer is impossible to know completely. We cannot interview them. We cannot read their written history. And we cannot assume that we understand their motives. What we do know is that their population is extremely vulnerable to diseases common elsewhere. Even an ordinary infection could potentially have devastating consequences for an isolated population. That is one reason Indian authorities continue to prohibit outsiders from approaching the island. North Sentinel Island is protected under Indian law. The surrounding waters are also restricted. Tourists are not allowed to visit. Researchers cannot simply land there. Missionaries cannot legally enter, and curious travelers cannot approach the shore just to take photographs. The policy is known in simple terms as eyes on, hands off. Observe from a distance, but do not interfere. Today, remarkably little is known about the Sentinelese. Estimates of their population vary. Their language remains largely undocumented. Their social structure is mostly unknown, and much of their history exists beyond written records. But perhaps that is exactly why North Sentinel matters. The island is not a time capsule. The Sentinelese are not people waiting to be introduced to civilization. They are a living indigenous society with their own history, their own culture, and their own right to decide how much contact they want with the outside world. For centuries, the modern world kept moving closer. Ships arrived. Colonial expeditions came. Scientists came. Filmmakers came. Missionaries came. And again, the island sent the same message. Stay away. Eventually, the outside world began to listen. Today, North Sentinel remains one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. Its beaches remain largely untouched. Its forests remain dense. And somewhere beyond those trees, a small community continues a way of life that has survived enormous changes beyond its shores. We may never know exactly how they came to the island. We may never fully understand their language, and we may never know what they think when they see a helicopter crossing the sky or a ship appearing on the horizon. But perhaps we don't need to know everything, because sometimes history teaches us something more important than discovery. It teaches us when to stop. North Sentinel's greatest mystery may not be what lies beyond its forest. It may be why, after centuries of outsiders trying to enter, the world finally decided to leave it alone. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about North Sentinel Island. Not that it has remained hidden from humanity, but that for the first time in its history, humanity has begun to understand that leaving it hidden may be the best way to protect the people who call it home. This is the story of North Sentinel Island, the island the world discovered and then chose to leave alone.